We are in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, the center of coal region of Pennsylvania, and this town was known in the late 19th century as Vilnius of America. It was the main Lithuanian capital of America before Chicago. And we are talking to Jim and Dot Setcavage today. So how it came to be that Shenandoah became so important for Lithuanian culture in Americas?
The Lithuanians were looking for a way to come over to the States and get involved in finding jobs. And they found it in the coal industry, which was located here in Shenandoah. So in about the end of the 1860s, Shenandoah became very popular, and it became populated with a lot of Lithuanian immigrants who had just come over. One of those immigrants was a priest. His name was Reverend Andrew Strapinskis, and he wanted to form a Lithuanian parish, which he did. He lived with his sister, and the Lithuanian people got together and formed the St. Casimir Society at the time to form the first Lithuanian parish in the United States. And Reverend Strapinskis was responsible for building this church. It was a wooden structure that was built and started in 1872. Approximately 5 years later, the church, then was under the Diocese of Philadelphia, and there was a change in the pastor. They removed Father Strapinskis, who spoke both Lithuanian and Polish. And once he was removed, they put in a new pastor who spoke only Polish, and the church claimed that it was a Polish parish. The Lithuanians had separated from that, but they no longer could form another St. Casimir church, since there was one in the diocese. So they formed themselves. They changed to the St. George Society, and they earned money. They ran benefits. They had masses in different halls in the town. Some of the other churches, maybe, or something else that was around where they could occupy it for a service. And in the 1890s, they purchased a corner of a block at Cherry and Jordan Streets in Shenandoah. They had enough money to purchase it, I think, which was about $40,000 or something like that. And from there, they started construction of the beautiful St. George Church, which was like a cathedral. They began their Lithuanian parish with fundraisers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it continued from there. And because of the coal region, many people had jobs, and they just kept coming in and coming in and coming in. And that was the way they started to form it and why they came here.
Indeed, this was just the first of many, many parishes in this region. There were more than 20 churches, or about 30 churches if you include also the northern coal region around Scranton and Wilkes-Barre. In the town of Shenandoah alone, there are about 6 Lithuanian cemeteries, which we have visited and mapped on the map.truelithuania.com website, and many other Lithuanian heritage sites here in this area. So it is especially important even to Lithuanian culture as a whole, as the first Lithuanian language novel anywhere in the world was published here in Shenandoah. And there are many, many other such stories. These churches, they were not only for religion, yes, they were like hubs of the entire community.
They were.
So what other activities would take place there? As I have read that some people even were saying that the sermons are too long, as they want to move on quicker to other activities and such. So could you tell us more about the life in the Lithuanian parish of St. George at the time?
It was a center of activity. They ran all kinds of church affairs, dinners, just like they do now in some churches, okay, to keep getting money more and more for the parish. And eventually they had fundraisers and dances and all kinds of activities going on. It just built up, and the church just expanded with that. And then we got new pastors who changed and kept changing, and they kept adding to the church. The church was started as a brick church, and then it erupted from there. And in a few years, they added granite block to the outside of it. Eventually, it changed and they kept adding and they put new steeples on it and bells were added to it. But all this was done through all these different things they did. We had many block parties in the town, which they still have in some areas. The whole people from an area would take it and say this was a block party, but then it became church block parties. They ran until, I'd say, maybe the 1960s that we had them very popular. Then there were bingo games and there were, bunco games and card games, and they'd have dinners, special dinners and things like that.
Were your family members of this parish since its beginning?
My grandmother was here when this part of this, she came in as a child in maybe 1889, 1890, somewhere. She was a very little girl. She came with 3 other sisters and her mom and dad. My great-grandfather, I should say, was one of the first people that were buried, but not from the whole church. I think they had the services by then in the basement because they kept adding to the church. And yes, my grandmother belonged her whole entire life to St. George Church. Therefore, my mother belonged to it. And eventually, my dad joined St. George when he married my mother in the 1930s. Gradually, I came along and I was a member of it, and then married Jim, who is a member of it because he came from the Mahoney City area. So he was a member of St. George Church, and we continued to be until the day they took it away.
Sadly though, when we look upon the town of Shenandoah today, we don't see these twin spires of a St. George Lithuanian Catholic Church anymore. The church was demolished. And what was the story behind that? People in Lithuania don't understand usually how a church could be demolished, but here in Cole region it seems not 1, not 2, not even 3 Lithuanian churches have been demolished, and among them St. George Lithuanian Church here. So what was the story behind that?
As we investigated, we found out that it was happening all across the United States. Especially the Catholic churches were closing and combining and selling off the churches and selling off the stained glass windows. And here in Shenandoah, we found out that we could not bring our structural engineers in, that we always brought in every year to find out if anything needed to be done. And we had just gone through $2 million in renovations at St. George, okay? So we were celebrating the 100th anniversary from 1891 to 1991, because 1891 was an important year, and some used 1890, I guess, as the freedom in Lithuania. But we understand it wasn't recognized by other countries until a year later. And we understand that the Russians came in to try to stop all that. We're very much tied in with Lithuania, okay, here at St. George. And we did have people that, had relatives in Lithuania. We always supported the cause of what was happening, okay, in Lithuania.
So you mentioned that the anniversary came and then it was renovated in 1991. And then how it continued from that on? You mentioned you were unable to bring the structural engineers in to check the church?
Always had our county structural engineers that we brought in separately for St. George to evaluate it, okay, on what was done, because it's such an expensive building. And we always maintained it. Anything that needed to be done, it was always done. When the diocese had their synod, S-Y-N-O-D, that was their meetings to decide what churches would be open and what churches would be closed. They wouldn't allow us to bring our structural engineers in to evaluate it. And we actually thought we were part of the synod process, where people would come into the church and look at it and evaluate it. And they said the church is too far gone for anyone to go inside. And our insurance, our diocese insurance, would not allow it. We began to realize that we were not part of the synod process, even though we did have a canon lawyer that was in touch with the diocese. But even the canon lawyer that we hired, actually from New York, was not allowed to go into the church. But at the same time, They allowed other workers to go in without any hard hats, without anything. Okay, they just wouldn't allow anybody that could evaluate the building to go in. We have pictures of people going in there without hat hearts and everything else. At the same time, they were telling us that it's impossible to go in. It might bring us back to our markers here. Back in 2004, when our longtime pastor, Father Potts, he was here for 19 years, was transferred. No one could really understand why he was being transferred. But anyway, the priest that they brought in, we knew that we were in danger because he transferred all of our funds to the diocese and cut off our maintenance. And at that time, 2004, we pursued a historic marker strictly for St. George. That's the bottom part of our marker there. It took us 3 years, and in 2007, we were granted the historic marker. As soon as the diocese found out that we were granted the historic marker, they contacted the Historic Commission and said, "We're tearing down the church. We don't want the historic marker." And that was the first time that we had heard anything about our church being torn down. In 3 years after 2007, in 2010, St. George was finally taken down. The diocese and their demolition company said the church would be down in 2 months, but it took them 7 months. It was very difficult because when they built the church, it was built out of brick, but they attached the granite block with cement. That was in the early 1900s there, 1914, 15, okay. And they were using jackhammers, and we got to know the workers, the demolition workers. A number of them were from around here, and they said, this church doesn't have to come down. It would last another 500 years. But they had to work there. It was a time when the economy was very slow, okay, in this area, right around that time. So they said they had to work, but the one worker that got killed, John Martz, we got to know, and he says, I get sick every time I come to work on taking this church apart. And he was taking days off, and then he came back, and he was on a lift because they couldn't bring the church down with an equipment called a claw. So what they did was they sent the lift underneath the claw with the jackhammer, and there were 2 men on it with one jackhammer, so they had to switch sides. But when they switched sides, they had to undo their belt and put it back on the other side of the lift. They had to keep changing sides. It's very tiring to work a jackhammer, okay, and they had a very hard time trying to get it off. But the claw was up above it at the time. The hydraulic line got cut, which meant it could not stabilize. It turned over, and John Martz fell to his death. They did bring in OSHA, which looks at all the ways that things were being done, and to make recommendations. They had to close it down for a number of weeks until they came up with a decision that they wouldn't use that claw anymore. So they had to painstakingly take it apart, block by block.
So why do you think the diocese decided that they need to just tear down a church they owned if they are not using that lot for anything anymore?
Right now they do have a priest that is living there. He's up in his 90s. And we're not sure because there have been attempts, even by the Knights of Lithuania, to buy that ground. The diocese just would not meet with anybody. So we're not sure. The deed for the ground is separate from the deed from the rectory. The ground, of course, was where the church was, and the rectory was a separate deed. So the priest, the elderly priest, is still staying there. We were in touch with our structural engineers that granite block was estimated at about $10 million. It was cemented, and I don't think the diocese and the ones that they ordered examined it closely enough to know that it would be difficult to take apart. And then we got into changing our historic marker from strictly St. George to Little Lithuania. So that took another 3 years of research, and the marker was finally approved in 2013. So we're very proud of this marker, and we do take it to all the Lithuanian events. And the topic is always brought up about the historic marker, even those that are coming from other states.
Yes, so the historic marker that celebrates that Shenandoah is the little Lithuania of America actually stands in the very center of the town, and everybody who visits the town may also see this historic marker. And even though the Church of St. George Lithuanian Church in Shenandoah is unfortunately destroyed, there are many other Lithuanian churches in the area. Some of them are still open. You can get inside and see the stained glass windows with Lithuanian inscriptions. Some others are closed, but the buildings still survive. And each one of them is marked on our map at map.lithuania.com. You can open that map online, see how each of these churches looks, read their stories, and also read about their cemeteries, as many of the parishes had their own cemeteries, including St. George Cemetery, and these cemeteries still survive, and tens of thousands, or actually more than 100,000 of Lithuanians are buried in these cemeteries, maybe even your relatives. Therefore, I encourage you to subscribe to this YouTube channel if you want to learn more about Lithuanians in America, Lithuanian churches in America, Lithuanian cemeteries in America, and a Lithuanian history of America.